This is a Viva PR podcast.
My job is to ultimately be responsible for all the journalism and content that we create at Reach. People are fascinated with what goes on to make news happen. For us, it's really, really important that our journalism is read by as many people as possible. Press Gazette did a series of investigations into the proliferation of fake experts. Proved to me that that person exists. We are no longer just the first draft of history. We're the front line when it comes to dis and misinformation.
Today on PR in the Real World, we're tackling some of the biggest issues facing both journalism and PR. My guest is David Higgerson, and he's the Chief Content Officer at Reach plc, which is one of the biggest UK publishers. David's responsible for the journalism and content strategy across more than 130 titles, from the Mirror and Express, and titles in the US and Ireland, to local brands that you're familiar with that are serving probably your community today. His career's tracked the industry's biggest shifts, from print-first newsrooms right through to this new frontline battle against misinformation. We've got so much to get through, so let's get on to it. David, thanks for coming down to see us in Rottenstall. How was the journey?
Well, all of 10 minutes, so good, thank you very much.
Chief Content Officer at Reach plc. Let's get started into that. What is a Chief Content Officer, and what does it cover?
So my job is to ultimately be responsible for all the journalism and content that we create at Reach, to have the plans that get it in front of as many people as possible, and to come up with the business model that sustains it going forward.
Wow. So, and how many titles are you kind of overseeing in that role?
So across the UK, we've got 130 titles, ranging from the Mirror, the Express, the Star and OK, through to 70 plus weekly newspapers, Chester Chronicle, Tamworth Herald, Rossendale Free Press, amongst the titles. Also got publications in Ireland and the USA.
Quite a remit. Full disclosure here, David and I know one another from days gone by. That I started my life at the Lancashire Telegraph, and David was in a sister paper a few years, but you can tell the grey hairs. That's quite a leap. Just for the tape, can you just give us a quick trot through the career and how you got to into the role that you're currently in?
Yeah, so did work experience when I was 15 at Rock FM in Preston. Had grand visions of becoming a radio DJ. Got put in the newsroom, away from the studio, and spent a week with 5 or 6 brilliant journalists there who were superb with their time. Became absolutely fascinated with the way news would just appear on this big machine. It was back when John Major was telling people to put up or shut up, and just became hooked from there. Did work experience on subsequently on one of the sister papers that you mentioned before. Struck lucky after my 18th birthday when a vacancy came up, so finished my A-levels, did that. Been a reporter around the north of England into the early mid-2000s, moved into news desk roles, and then got the opportunity to launch the Liverpool Daily Post website over there. Became absolutely fascinated by the immediacy that you suddenly got from journalism when you're serving it up online, and the instant reaction that you got. I was very lucky to work with people who were ahead of the curve within regional press for taking online seriously, and the role grew into a group role. And over the last 10 or 15 years, I've done various other roles that have ultimately led to me being responsible for the journalism at Reach.
The reaction of your colleagues, you were telling me earlier, when you took that website editor role on, they were scratching their heads, a few of them, weren't they? They were saying, well, why are you going down that little rabbit hole?
Yeah, it was fascinating because again, very early in my career, I was lucky that in the first wave of digital journalism, the company I was working for ran This Is Lancashire, and we realised that we could scoop our daily rival by publishing to the internet, because we only came out once a week. So we did lots of that, so I got a taste for it then, realised what it could do. The whole industry retrenched from that. So when it came up as another opportunity, what you found was there was a lot of scepticism about, well, that didn't work last time, why would it work this time? You should focus on becoming a news editor, then an editor, and what have you. But the great thing about it was not a lot of people took what we did that seriously. The editor did, but we were allowed to try stuff that frankly you would never have done with the Liverpool Daily Post in print or the Liverpool Echo in print, and very quickly things worked. And we started showing how you could bring stories to life, and actually how you get better stories by engaging with people in real time. But certainly there was a view of, crikey, why would you want to do that? The growth, the real career progression is the same route that had been there for the previous 100 years.
I guess at that time, and in my days in newspapers, the newsroom was the hub of everything, and the public and the readers were out beyond those walls, and you were breaking those walls down, I guess, at that time in a way that was very novel and new.
Yeah, supported and challenged by sort of real evangelists in the wider business, the wider newsroom. One of the things we did relatively early on was we led the way with live blogging. Everything from football matches through to court cases. And one day we decided to live blog a day in the life of the newsroom, which included live streaming conference, which, has to be said, was the most mundane conference we'd ever done. It was so polite and well-meaning and nothing like a normal news conference. But the reaction we got to that was, and we still see it today, is people are fascinated with what goes on to make news happen. And what goes into it, and that's what we had the opportunity to do back then, was give people the real-time sense of what we were doing at different points of the day.
Yeah, I think we're so used to that now, but I guess turning the clock back, all of that was kind of fresh and exciting. I mean, you've worked through huge structural change in the media. Just walk me through some of the kind of like the changes you've witnessed in your career.
I entered journalism at a point when free newspapers were still proliferating everywhere, and they were the place to advertise. The point at which I entered the profession, you still found out what was on at the cinema that weekend because it was in an advert in the paper. So obviously the first seismic shake we had was around 2007, 2008, when the classified vertical started going elsewhere. That led to a lot of shrinking straight away in newsrooms, and many parts of the industry weren't quite ready to make the changes to the newsrooms that needed to be made on the back of that, because the other thing that was going on there was Facebook was growing, Twitter was in its infancy. People were much more comfortable with the sharing of information amongst themselves, less worried about having necessarily a source of truth to get their information from. How do we become part of that? Probably one of the biggest things that I worked on was the launch of our digital first newsroom, which was around 2012, 2013. We first did that in Manchester and Newcastle. And that was where we said to the newsrooms, essentially, don't worry about where it's going to go in the newspaper, just write for what the online audience wants, and leave our print experts to create the best newspapers possible with that. And that was the thing that ultimately drove our growth from being important but not big online to being able to boast about the fact that we still reach 50-60% of the population in areas of Greater Manchester. Video's come and gone during that time, and it's obviously back in a big way now. And probably the really big thing for us is, if you assume so far we've gone from being print first to digital first, we're now moving into a world where we're as interested in what our journalism is doing on platforms we don't own as we are on the platforms that we do own. What
do you mean by that?
So many of our newsrooms will devote a lot of time to packaging up journalism to just be read on Facebook. If people visit the site back, brilliant, and that's ultimately what we want, because that's how you drive the loyalty, it's how you drive the subscriptions. But for us, it's really, really important that our journalism is read by as many people as possible, because that's how it can do the most good.
You've had to undergo a real mindset shift, because that would be an anathema to the world that we enter, to kind of give content away like that.
Yeah, I guess it's there's almost two stages to it. There's the why did you start giving it away for free in the first place dilemma and debate, and now there's the kind of, well, what's in it for you to have a journalist talking about their story on TikTok if that person's not going to visit your site, sign up for a subscription, buy a newspaper. But the daily battle we have as newsrooms is reminding people that we're there and that they can trust us. And if we're going to ultimately get the subscription or the loyalty or the engagement, we need to be turning up where they are. But it's a million miles away from job number one being you wanted every single person to do the same thing, which is buy the newspaper.
Yeah.
Although we still have hundreds of thousands of people that do that every day, and we need to protect that for as long as we can.
I'm interested in that shift from a very kind of agency perspective, because in the 24 years that we've been working at Viva, we've been obviously impacted by the changing dynamic there. And when we started, we could call up the local newspaper, speak to the business editor, go and meet them, have a brew with them, and talk about the clients that we've got and some of the stories that they might be interested in, and build a relationship. It's much trickier now that the disparate world has shifted.
I'm not sure it is. I'm because ultimately what you're describing there is a one-to-one relationship, and yes, if this had been 20 years ago, you could have gone to the cafe near the office, etc. I think sometimes, and I think both sides, if you want to put it like that, fall into this trap, is because in any one communication we can broadcast to many, doesn't mean we should. Yeah. And I think those I look around our business, and I think in some cases those individual relationships are every bit as strong. It's just that people on both sides have cracked having them virtually. Yeah. And I think probably the harder bit is the fact that we do ask journalists to do far more and work at a much more frenetic pace than perhaps was the case 20 years ago. So maybe getting that first moment of attention to build the relationship. But that's where I find it fascinating seeing. I feel LinkedIn is becoming the space that journalists used to find on Twitter. Yeah. And it's fascinating watching relationships form on there. So I think it's still possible to have those relationships. They're probably just much more likely to be virtual relationships, and they involve us having to sometimes park the desire to make the most of the fact that we can talk to lots of people all in one go.
And I guess that you were saying before the red light came on that journalists are far more kind of accessible or targeted in a way that you and I were never in our day, and you've got a duty of care and to protect them from harm as well.
So I promise not to do loads of anecdotes today, but I can remember once when I was the local government reporter at the Evening Telegraph, and there was a Tory, the leader of the Tories had been really scathing about regeneration in Blackburn. This guy subsequently went on to be the leader of the council, and he said to me, what you have to remember, David, is Blackburn's just a grotty little mill town. Now that was a front page story straight away. The next night at the cabinet meeting, he stood up and denounced me, denounced the Evening Telegraph, said he didn't say it, etc., etc. And I was outraged, and I went to the editor, and because I wanted the editor to write a letter to or whatever, and the editor just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Look, we know it's right, etc., etc." I mentioned that in the context of then the thing went away. These days, it's very, very common, and this is actually some of the lower level targeting we get, for politicians to single out journalists because they've taken offence at a particular story. And a great example of that is in Nottinghamshire, where Reform came in, took over the council. The council leader took offence at the Nottinghamshire Live's coverage of local government reorganisation. Let's be honest, one of the dullest stories out there. And that's what all that was based around. Had he just banned Nottinghamshire Live, we could have dealt with that in a proper way, and ultimately they backed down when we threatened legal action. But there were constant attacks on the quality of the journalism that was done there. Lee Anderson, the Reform MP, claimed to have hundreds of people writing to him every week about the appalling journalism at Nottinghamshire Live. Now, we both know how newsrooms work. If people want to tell a journalist they don't like the work, they tell them, they don't write to the local MP. So you read into that what you will. But and it's non-stop. And I think when we were talking before, sometimes I think of that NSPCC advert, which shows the child with all the hate coming out of the TV, the laptop at home. And that's what's different for us now versus 20 years ago. Is there is always a way for somebody to get to you to tell you what they think about what you've done. Now, social media has brought huge benefits to the way that we do journalism. it's also, and it's actually, in the main, it's a really good thing that we can see what people are saying about our work in real time. But we do, unfortunately, in this country and in the US and elsewhere, have significant figures who have almost made it legitimate for people to say very awful things about journalists, and sadly that manifests itself into real life threats from time to time.
We're living in this age of anything that certain people don't like is branded fake news and so on, and your mainstream media and seen as an insult, and playing into that world must be interesting.
Yeah, sometimes a lot of it is the modern way of saying, oh, that's just tabloid. So you kind of part that to one side. The bit I worry about more is when it becomes quite corrosive. And I think it's important that when we talk about what happened with Nottinghamshire Live and Reform is, yes, Reform got a lot of attention for that, but Reform by no means are the only political party to have sought to demean journalism in a way that we haven't necessarily seen so overtly in the past. One of the best pieces of journalism on this I've ever read was by Jennifer Williams, who used to be at the Manchester Evening News, and she wrote about the way Labour activists were actively encouraged to boo and hiss the media at Labour's 2019 media election launch in Trafford. And that was the party that at that point could easily have gone on to become the party of government. And we see it in all the other parties as well. And it's very, we can never set out to be part of every single conversation where people are challenging us and discussing, and we should be open to challenge, and it's really important to have the regulated media through IPSO, etc., etc. But yes, it is far too easy for people to just say, oh yeah, well that's just the media, don't trust that, and it becomes a very convenient scapegoat for politicians, public figures, businesses, to try and distract attention away from when they're doing things wrong. And I think a good example of just how dangerous that train of thought comes is, how have we ended up with a lobbying group attached to the Labour Party paying to dig up dirt on investigative journalists from the Sunday Times?
Yeah. No, I was listening to that just this morning. I guess to take things back to kind of a lot of our listeners will be from agencies or in-house comms people. And they'll be saying, Tony, ask him how we can get coverage in a reach title. What's the smartest way to approach it these days?
Have a great story to tell, and think about how your story that you want to tell helps us be useful, memorable, or reliable to readers. Because ultimately, they're not the three sexiest words that get people going to journalism school in the first place, but they're the things that bring people back to websites on a regular basis. One of the fascinating things about what happened in the early 2010s was, you remember the whole craze around people talking about journalism, and it was press releases that went straight into the print book to keep story count up and have you. What digital analytics taught us very quickly was an awful lot of the stuff that went back of book or mid-book, or however you want to describe it, or grout, for the incredibly dismissive phrase for journalism, was that people didn't, in some cases, didn't want to read it at all. And then the challenge for us as journalists is we no longer have that guaranteed right to be in somebody's living room at tea time. How do we make them spend time with us rather than playing Roblox or watching EastEnders or doing what have you? So that message that you want to get out, that narrative, or that story that you want to tell, how can you help us tell that in a way that makes a reader want to spend 30 seconds with it, and ideally for you and ideally for us, that they would then want to share it on? And if you start there, I think you end up in a very, very constructive relationship with the journalist very quickly.
And that shifts that conversation on from a press release and a potentially a picture to a multimedia perspective, I guess, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, we're as interested in, we want as many people on our websites as possible and coming back as frequently as possible. We want to live in a world where we don't need to worry about algorithms. In an ideal world, everybody in Greater Manchester will visit the Manchester Evening News a few times a month. And we do see whenever there's a loud bang somewhere in Greater Manchester, or people see lots of fire engines, we will know something's happening in Greater Manchester by the spike in traffic we see to the MEN's homepage. Our job then is to find out what the thing is, and that's where social media is brilliant, etc., etc. So, but that relationship is something we really have to cherish and keep working at. And for us, that's why text is really important, stills are really important, but video, audio, what can you do with us to help us amplify that story as far as we possibly can do?
We often hear, that regional newspapers are dead and regional news is on its feet because of the shifts that we've seen, and definitely circulation figures would certainly back that argument up. But you've created a network, and you've got a whole host of journalists on the ground that refute that. It's just that they're not all in one building in towns anymore.
No, and it's a live debate within journalism about the importance of newsrooms, and we like a lot of publishers had pared back the number of offices that we had pre the pandemic, and then did so more during the pandemic, because actually what you really want, particularly for local news, is people based in the communities that they're writing about. And that's the magic of local journalism, is if you're walking down Oxdown High Street having written something that somebody disagrees with, you want the council leaders to talk to you about it. You want people to give you feedback. So there are fewer local journalists than there were 10, 15, 20 years ago. There's no doubt about that. There are definitely stories which are not being told, and we've had to prioritise the stories that do get told. Part of that is the financial changes of the business, advertising going elsewhere. Part of that is changing audience habits as well. I'd love to be in the world where, sort of as we saw on the day the war ended in 1945, it was actually remarked upon in the Birmingham Post how many people were queuing up to buy a copy of the Birmingham Mail that day. I'd love for us still to live in that world, but people can get their information from anywhere now. And to your point before, people are also, in some cases, much more selective about where they get their information from, because it suits what they think. So, but what I would say is local journalism isn't dead. Local journalism is still changing communities for the good. It's championing communities at a time when there was very few other people championing them. And I work with amazing newsrooms around the UK. I also get to spend time with other publishers as well. And then there are hyperlocal sites that are coming through as well. We seem to spend a lot of time in our industry telling each other why each other's model is wrong. Actually, if we spent a bit more time talking about all the good work that we are trying to do, and that we are all ultimately going in the same direction, and to the same aim, which is securing the future of local journalism. And job number one for that is actually pointing out to people that it's not dead and that it is making a big difference. And we see that in spades.
Just to kind of shift things on a little bit, I mean, we can't have a conversation these days about comms without bringing up AI. And you made the PR industry headlines last week with a story about based on fake experts and verification, and at the heart of it, this idea that you're going to create a list, or you're creating a list of trusted PR agencies. So kind of two questions in one here. One, what was the genesis of this? Why was it needed? And two, how do I get on the list?
Well, dealing with the first one first. Press Gazette did a series of investigations into the proliferation of fake experts, and pretty much every publisher and broadcaster had examples of where press releases had come in, they'd been taken at face value. And we should always remember that journalism is an industry that is underpinned by trust at every step of the way. And it had garnered, there were good stories, often in lifestyle topics, which were interesting to readers, but the people who were talking about it didn't exist. And it was a new one for the industry in the sense that, certainly for as long as I've been in journalism, if a press release landed, you would want to spend time sort of stress testing and verifying the content of the email rather than the existence of the person allegedly saying it.
Yeah, you didn't really have to check out whether it was a real person.
No, but fair play to press, they've called it to attention. There were a couple of sort of quite egregious examples. I think everybody's heard about My Job Quote, for example. And it's dead easy for us to say, right, anything that comes in from that now, we don't touch. But what it became clear was this was a much bigger problem across industry, and by that I mean the media industry and the PR industry, because, for example, some PR agencies that we do work with on a regular basis were coming up as having supplied fake experts to us. They had sourced the quotes and information to support their press release in good faith, but so the problem was almost 2 steps removed from us. What we didn't want to do, and sometimes it has been a bit sort of misportrayed, I think, when people have been talking about it, what we didn't want to do is take away from the key fundamental, which is it's a journalist's job to verify and know everything they know, everything that goes in the story, they know that it's correct to the best of their knowledge. That now clearly needs to include prove to me that person exists. Then the news editor or whoever's publishing it needs to make sure that check has been made. And at Reach, because we will publish stuff right across our network, if there's a story in Birmingham that the Liverpool Echo think will be interesting to their audience, it's incumbent on the Liverpool Echo to do the checks on that journalism before it's published there. That's the way our network works. So the question then became for us is, how do we make this easier for journalists to go about the verification process? Because where AI makes this really tricky is, well, is there a picture of them on the internet? Well, 5 years ago that would have been fine. AI can create that. What's their LinkedIn profile like? Oh, that can easily be faked as well. So options on the table were, well, we can just stop doing stuff from press releases at all and source everything from scratch, but actually who loses out in that? The reader, because there's loads of great stuff comes in every day, every week. We can insist that full verification is done on every individual, which is to the nth degree. Well, that again slows the process down, but ultimately is what we're having to do in a lot of cases now. So what can we add in there? So one of the things we've come up with is a centrally held database of PR agencies where journalists are within our organisation are happy to vouch for them and say, I've worked with so and so for a number of years, never had any problems at all, and they go on that list. So any journalist in our organisation can type in sort of Joe Blogg's PR of Basildon. Well, if they're on the list, that means that they can, with confidence, move on to the verification of the content matter rather than the existence of the person. Yeah. If they're not on the list, we're in that space of, can you verify this person exists? So that's the genesis. And then the how to get onto the list, it is very much a case of, I don't want to be, or nor do I want Reach to be sort of the gatekeeper of what good PR looks like. Although I have been much more popular on my email from PR just to say last week or so. What I really want is for our newsrooms to be saying, happy for this company to go on the list because I've worked with them for a long period of time. Yeah. And then it becomes it's almost a crowdsourcing exercise. Seen a lot of speculation about what our ultimate intent with it is, and no, people do not have to pay to appear on the list. And people, it'd be wrong for me to be putting companies on the list because I'm not operating as a reporter day in, day out, or a news editor day in, day out. So it's about taking the relationships that we've got across our 1,800 journalists in the UK, and where those relationships are worth going onto the list, the reporter can do that.
Fine. Thank you for clearing that up. The whole kind of fake expert thing is really fascinating. Where do you think it's come from, and what drives it?
I think where it comes from is there's always somebody looking for a shortcut, and they've found one. And it's a little bit like the AI debate in general. You can talk to a cancer expert who tells you how it's actually going to ensure there's no cancer in 10 years' time. You can speak to a recruitment agency who says there's going to be no jobs in 10 years' time. And both are probably have a kernel of truth in there. So with every new invention comes a bad deployment of it. 5 years ago, we'd have link agencies approaching our newsrooms asking for links onto our websites, and you have examples of journalists and editors being essentially offered backhanders to do it. We've always been very, very firm that we don't do paid links because, frankly, when you're trying to reach 35 million people a month, you need Google on your side, not penalising you. So I think it's an extension of that. As we've moved into an AI summaries world on Google, where it becomes so important for businesses to feel they're being name checked, in the hope that their information will appear in the AI summary. I think it's come from that, and the ability to somebody has recognised, or people have recognised, that newsrooms are hungry for strong lifestyle content that people enjoy reading, people find useful, and actually it's far easier to stand that up in multiple examples and get companies' names by creating fake experts rather than doing it the hard way. So that's where I think it's come from.
Have you seen any particular examples through Reach that you've been astounded by, or is it just you there but for the grace of God go on?
That's a really good question. I think some of the examples, most of the examples have been in spaces where it's hard to see that something awful could happen as a result of somebody following the information from it. Right. That's not me saying therefore it's okay, because I'm definitely not saying that. Yeah. But one of the rules we've now got in place as part of our new approach to fake experts is, if you're quoting people who are being quoted as experts in money or health matters, we do an extra tier of verification, or the journalist does an extra tier of verification to understand their credentials to be talking about that.
Right.
So to give you an example, there's sometimes some debate about when is an expert really an expert, and there was one that was pushed our way that was apparently considered to be a fake expert because he was being described, or she was being described, as a sleep expert. Well, they'd run a bed shop for 30 years, a bed business. Now, that becomes a debating point as to whether they're an expert or not, but there's no doubt they've sold beds for 30 years. They probably know what they're talking about when it comes to getting a good night's sleep, would be a view. So I think, and fair play to Press Gazette, I think they've highlighted it relatively early on. What the whole process shows, I think, is that for journalism to succeed, there needs to be a level of trust at every step of the journey. The news editor needs to trust the journalist who's created the story. The journalist needs to be able to trust the source of the story, and that's a fragile ecosystem which AI has facilitated the ability for somebody to break.
And I guess ultimately the end user, the reader, needs to be able to trust the title or the journalist that's putting the story out there. The trust and reputation could be damaged by this new gaming of the system. We've reached a point now in time. How do you see this rolling out? Because we're only just getting used to the concepts, aren't we?
We are, and the ability to be duped in journalism has always been there. It was only a few weeks ago the Times talked about how somebody pretended to be, a significant American politician, and I don't want to use the phrase "they fell for that" because it suggests a slapdash approach on their part. And I don't think it was. If somebody's determined to mislead and dupe, they'll often find a way to do it. It takes you into the world very quickly. If we received a video 2 years ago into the newsroom, you could largely take it as that's what happened. Yeah. These days, the first thing is you count the number of fingers on the people who are in it. And I say that flippantly, and the reason I say that is now is because that's a tell now. In 18 months' time, it won't be a tell. No. And journalism is littered with examples where people have had the wool pulled over their eyes by seemingly very authentic material that's been submitted with them. So the scarier thing for me is less about the ability of journalism to be duped, because I think what fake experts has taught us is how we can respond, but is the ability of that information or that fakery to reach a wide audience completely unchecked in the first place. And we saw the starts of that during the riots triggered by the events in Southport, in Liverpool and Manchester, and particularly in Birmingham. There was video being shared supposedly showing, gangs attacking each other and what have you. And it was from completely different places. And I think one of the things I take heart from is just how much you hear the government crediting the fact that local media, in many ways, helped curb what could have been a tinderbox situation that could have escalated far further than it did. And that's why local journalism in particular is so crucial because we are no longer just the first draft of history. We're the front line when it comes to dis and misinformation. And that tidal wave of disinformation and misinformation is only going to get worse.
You've talked previously about algorithms and data, and let's be fair, Reach has sometimes been accused of prioritising clickbait kind of stories. Fair comment?
Look, are there stories that we write that I look at them and think, yes. But I would defy anybody who's done any version of my job at any point in history to go through a body of work that they've ultimately been responsible for and be happy with absolutely everything that was published. What we have done at Reach is liberalise data across our organisation, so everybody can see at any given moment what's working and what isn't. And for me, it's really, really important people can see that, because it tells us what people are interested in. For me, sometimes when people shout clickbait, what they're really shouting is, I don't like this story. Are there occasions when the headline pushes the story too far, but it pushes too far versus the story? Absolutely. And that is where we see that. We say, look, that can't be the way to do it, because ultimately what we're trying to do is build a relationship so that the reader wants to come back again and again. And where somebody who disagrees with a story or disagrees with an approach on a story, they may shout clickbait or they may shout mainstream media, but you can have a debate around that. Where somebody reads something and goes, that just isn't borne out by what you're saying here, that's what we need to guard against. And does that sometimes happen? I think more times than often what happens is the wrong part of the story is focused on for the headline, rather than it actually being, telling you that something's yellow when it's actually red. And the challenge for us in those moments is to say, okay, well, what was the intention behind that story? Why were you writing that story? Why did you want to write it that way? And how do we write that story in a way that gives the reader what they want? Yeah. So I'll give you an example of a story which has divided opinion. We had a story at the weekend about a celebrity losing their dog. The dog had died. And the journalist described it as a family tragedy. And there's an interesting school of thought with some of our journalists that people have assumed that was a family member that they'd lost. And if that person has clicked onto that story and realised, oh, it's the dog, do they think it's clickbait? Do they think it's being misled? As somebody who lost a dog when it was 2 years old to being run over, I'm firmly of the view that is a family tragedy. I read that story and thought, that's really sad. And that tells you the kind of the nuance that we have to work with is we have to work with both making sure that the headline reflects the story, but also, wherever possible, reflects the many different starting points the person will have when they first see that story, because they'll see 4 or 5 words on social media or in search or on a homepage, and people are programmed, and the social media algorithms have made this more so, are programmed to make up their minds very quickly about something, and that's what we have to work with. So I guess there's almost a scale that we work within, and what we want to avoid at all costs is ever being in a situation where somebody feels they're being cheated by us, or actively cheated by us.
I guess it's a consequence of that shifting world as well. I mean, I remember, again, I'm showing my age here, but I remember when we introduced colour into newspapers, and the initial reaction was we just put everything in colour, all the headlines in different coloured fonts and so on, and it looked somebody described it to me as like somebody had thrown a mouldy peach against the wall and it slid down.
Yeah, because the printing was never amazing either, was it?
No, you never got the register just right. It certainly felt like to me there was a period 10, 15 years ago when people like yourself were first seeing the numbers and seeing what would move the numbers. That there was a bit of a Wild West period where, if we put Dragon's Den in the headline, we'll get, even if the story's got nothing to do with Dragon's Den or a Dragon's Den star, but somehow if we can manipulate that, we'll get a click. And we need clicks because that's the currency of the day now, not circulation. And it feels like that's, you what you said was really kind of sensible and genuine, and but it feels like that. I mean, why invent the word clickbait if what you've been describing was how people have been practicing all along?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to sit here and say there's nothing that's could ever fall in the category of clickbait's appeared on one of our websites for sure. What I think actually we spent a lot of time over the last decade learning, and frustratingly, I do think as the industry more generally has become smarter about actually what people value, all of a sudden the AI farms have come along. So I'll give you an example. It's Google Discover's a major referrer of traffic these days. And we work very closely with Google. We've got a good relationship with Google sometimes. And they were all very, very keen that they only let trusted sources into Google Discover. But for about 3 or 4 months now, publishers like Reach, The Independent and others have been squeezed out of Google Discover at the weekend by a process which involves you buying a recently defunct domain. In one case, it was a Holiday Inn somewhere in the West End of London. And they have this catalogue of clickbaity finance articles. Every weekend, the pension age was being lowered. And it followed the same format. Picture a Keir Starmer, pension age announcement, etc., etc. And in the monitoring tools, we have these things getting tens of millions of clicks when proper journalism isn't. So I do think as the industry has moved from scale to engagement, although it does need to be an engagement within scale, there's these other things coming up on the side which are making life hard for us. What I would say though is it's easy to focus on the 1% and 2%, but we came out of the first decade of the 21st century, I think, in journalism, not really knowing for sure what people found valuable for us. And I think this was particularly true in the local news space.
Yeah.
The best example I can give of that is a lot of football match reports very quickly became clear didn't work online because particularly for Premier League clubs, because people were either at the match or they were watching it on one of the dodgy streams. What people did want was player ratings. What people did want were what were the 5 things that the Manchester United writer learnt from the match, the Blackburn Rovers writer learnt from the match, and being able to interact with the writer during the match themselves. Now that's a huge change for a sports writer who's used to being at the ground, watching the action, and still for print providing the definitive 600-word report on what's happened between Birmingham City and Coventry City. But what readers were saying they really wanted to know is what that writer thought out of 10 for Birmingham City's goalkeeper, or the 5 moments that you missed. So we come through that. If you treat the last 10, 12 years as learning, we're much better placed to understand what's the things that really people get value from. And I think what we've probably learned as journalists is that an awful lot of what we felt people valued was really just part of the bundle they were paying 50p for in the early 2000s.
Yeah, we had no way of telling, did we? Are there any good examples of what you mean by data journalism these days and how good journalists are using data to elevate stories or campaigns?
I think so we've had a data unit at Reach since 2012. It's a team of 5 or 6 people, and their job is there is no shortage of data sets out there. But the worst thing you can do, and I say this as somebody who's a local government reporter, is just report numbers of people because people zone out to it. The other thing we need to be super careful of is a lot of the places in the country where we have titles are generally at the bottom end of league tables for everything because they're the areas with high levels of poverty, high levels of deprivation, all the associated things that come with that. So what we've tried to do with data journalism is tell stories with it, but make sure it's as relevant to people straight away. So a great example of that in the last couple of weeks has been, we've got a tracker that we use that shows every bank branch in the UK that's closed, and whenever Santander or whoever announced their next closures, refresh that, publish it. Or use it having widgets which mean that when how did your MP vote in the winter fuel debacle, you could find that out straight away. So that's the publicly available data, how you present that. But it's then getting the other data sets and doing exciting things with that. The thing that we always wrap around that is make it easy to present, make sure you hit the reader around the head why this matters to them, because most readers have got 30 seconds till they move on to the next thing. They need to invest something in this, make it useful, memorable and reliable.
You talked again before the red light came on about a particular example of the MEN around a campaign that they'd done that really had a powerful impact. Do you want to talk to us about that? Yeah. And that was that combination of good old-fashioned journalism, but being able to use the data element as well.
Yeah, so what I was talking about before was journalism that's built on data. The example that we're talking about here is using the data and insight for be that page use, time spent, and what have you. So the MEN, by dint of being the biggest regional news brand in the UK, often will be, oh yeah, and if you've seen what they've done here, so all they write about is Coronation Street. Well, to be fair, it is on patch. Oh, they've written about Molly May Hague again, also local. But also, we very much see the Manchester Evening News as a national for the north of England, and that's where we want to position it going forward. And what the MEN has done spectacularly well over successive editors over the last decade is use incredible journalism, but really, really put at the heart of that journalism the audience data. Not in a kind of nobody will read that, but if people look at it and go, not sure people will read that, how do you get that to as many people as possible? So the example I always give is the MEN News Desk got a tip off that a 2-year-old little boy had died at a flat in Rochdale, and it was believed he died as a result of conditions caused by the fact that his flat was full of mould. And that's all the MEN had to go off. They knew which estate it was on. They sent a reporter out, and that reporter spent the best part of 2 weeks knocking doors to find out who it was. Now, for the MEN to be able to, in the 21st century, is a free-to-air model to free up somebody to do that for 2 weeks. You need to have lots of other journalists back in the newsroom who are creating journalism that people are reading in large numbers. And that's where, put bluntly, people reading about Coronation Street is helping fund that sort of journalism. And one of the things I love about working with the journalists I work with at Reach is the journalists who get to spend the time on the journalism that is a slower burn, really, really value the work that their colleagues do to create the space for them to do that. So Stephen Topping goes and knocks on lots of doors. He gets the story. It's not enough just for the MEN to report that story. The MEN knows that it needs to get something. A little boy has died because he's been failed by the local housing association. This needs to be read by people. It's not enough just to put it on the homepage at 5 o'clock on a Friday and hope for the best. What's the newsletter strategy for it? What's the time to publish it? Do they go in with a straight intro? Do they do it as a sort of a long job weekend read? How do they chunk up the story? How do they make sure it's sold well on social? When I was when I was the assistant news editor on the Lancashire Evening Telegraph, my job was to make sure the stories fit a certain length, and then a whole different department would put it in the paper and what have you. Our news desk do all of this. As a result of just understanding how to get a story to travel, and nobody wakes up in the morning thinking to themselves, I need to find out if there's any bad news in Rochdale today. You need to convince people to read it. 100,000 people read that story. Amongst those 100,000 people were people from the BBC who then followed it up, were local MPs, and the MEN then kept with the story. Shelter came on board. That then became, the little boy was soon known, Awab Ishak. That then became a campaign for better standards in social housing. It's an absolute scandal in the 21st century. We have to have a campaign so that little children can grow up in council houses that haven't got mould in them, but that's where we are. And last October that became law. And none of that would have been possible had the MEN not had A, great journalism in its newsroom, and B, great understanding about how to get that journalism to lots of people.
I mean, that's a really good campaign and really well landed. And we've talked about video, and we've kind of touched on AI as well, but we've looked at AI on a negative side. On the kind of more positive side of things, you've built your own internal AI tool, I think. And where does AI, do you think, genuinely help journalism in the modern age?
Oh, there's so many use cases for it. Our starting point is we don't want AI to replace journalists. We want AI to free up journalists to focus on the parts of the job that hopefully they enjoy the most, but certainly have the most value. So, for example, even with the 75 local democracy reporters that we employ at Reach as part of the BBC scheme, some of them are covering 3 councils in London. With the best will in the world, they're not going to read every agenda paper. So that means they have to use their gut instinct to go, well, actually, I think this one's the one to focus on. AI tools now exist to provide a concise summary of what's going on in each agenda paper. They will only get more sophisticated. The big use that everybody talks about at Reach is Guten, and I'll give you an example of Guten helps us eliminate duplication. A real example of that is lots of people care about what happens on This Morning every morning, even though it's watched by about 1 million people because most people are at work. Lots of our newsrooms are aware of that, and lots of our newsrooms would have This Morning on in the office to watch, and if Alison Hammond said something daft, or if there was this celebrity interview, or if Reese Witherspoon said something outrageous when she was promoting the new series of the morning show, or something like that, that would probably get written in 15 different places. What Guten enables us to do is you have one person doing that, and we can tailor that story to the different markets using technology. It's then all checked by the same person before it's published. That frees up 14 people to do other things. I think the Epstein files is fascinating in the way that we've probably never in the history of journalism had so much information dumped on successive Friday tea times. And I know there are loads of use cases where people are sticking those files through AI tools to try and find lines that are hidden in there. From celebrities in there through to sort of different angles and what have you. That gives journalists more time to do other things. And ultimately, the situation we are in is that media is probably the most challenged it ever has been. The revenue model is changing. How do we harness AI to keep doing the things that society needs us to do when there's less money available to fund it?
Which brings me to a question about how do you create that sustainable local journalism model into the 2030s? And that must be one of your things that you go to bed at night worrying about.
So, yes. However, I think it's easy to look back at the last 10, 12 years and say local journalism strayed into lots of things it shouldn't be doing. And as I said, the industry loves pointing out each other's faults and stuff. Oh, that was clickbait, or that went too far, that was wrong, you got too many ads. Everything we've done over the last 10 years, 15 years, has enabled us to be of a size that we frankly wouldn't have been had we not done it over the last 10 or 15 years. I think there's a greater appreciation in society generally that news costs money. We need to be very careful we don't create a world where only the people who can afford news are informed, because that's a really, really dangerous place. And our CEO, Piers North, speaks very powerfully about not creating that world. But at the same time, having a funding model that works. So maybe there's a case that to a certain extent people had to realise what they were in danger of losing before they started paying. There are some positive stories out there. NewsQuest has got north of 100,000 subscribers. I speak to Iliff Media, who've got titles in the southeast. They're doing very well with it. We've been blown away by the response to having a premium tier on some of our websites, and that will continue to roll out as well. So what I see in the future is a hybrid model where, for as long as the BBC is there, we will probably have to have a lot of our content free to air. That's not a judgment on whether the BBC should exist or not, but it's just a fact of life. We need to do everything we can for Ofcom to understand that when the BBC does something, it does have a profound impact on the commercial sector, but that's not the BBC's fault. That's the fault of the regulation system around it. But how do we then say to readers, right, we want to be useful, reliable, memorable to you, so that actually when we start saying, actually, that is going to cost you $3.99 a month, $4.99 a month, or £1 to access it, or whatever the figure is, people feel like it's absolutely a good use of their money. And that's how I think you build the sustainable local journalism model. The other part of that I think doesn't get talked about enough is there's so much more that government can do to make it easier for local journalism to be relevant. Things like sensible access to court lists, police forces being much more open about what's going on. If I go to, I haven't been for a few years, but when I used to go to the journalism conferences in America, I used to be fascinated by the fact that there are still police forces in the States where every single crime that happens will make it into the local paper because it's just a given that information flows freely. That's not happened in this country for 20 years or more. No. Councils, some behave very, very badly in terms of the amount of information that they release. 25 years ago, the Local Government Act came in and meant that in the case of, say, a Lancashire County Council, decisions worth many hundreds of thousands of pounds don't need to be made in public anymore. The Freedom of Information Act, sort of described by Tony Blair and Jack Straw as the worst bit of legislation they did, which was a baffling statement. But I get what they're saying because they didn't realise what they were unleashing. But that has now become a game between journalists and councils and other bodies about how can they get away without releasing anything at all. And the reason all of that matters is we can crack the funding model, and we will crack the funding model. But we need to have the principles set down to give us the access to the information, to get it out to the public. And it goes back to a certain extent to what we're talking about, some of the behaviour of significant figures towards the media. Yeah. Is you can't on one hand knock lumps out of your local news organisation, then turn up at the start of local journalism week and talk about how amazing local journalism is. There's a civic responsibility that everybody involved in civic life needs to play there. And bluntly, a large part of the public sector needs to be told by government to behave better.
Interesting. There's quite a few local government listeners, so I'm sure that'll go down really well. I was
always popular with Blackburn with Darwin Council. So
you're clearly still very passionate about the industry. You joined in the late 90s. Where does that come from? That passion, you think?
There are people who will tell you that as soon as they could pick up a pen, they wanted to be a journalist. I'm not one of those people, but I've seen journalism make a difference on so many points of my career, not just stuff I've been involved in. I still my kids hate me telling this story, but I do it all the time. Is when I go to Clitheroe, there's a care home there that is next to just near where the Everyman is. It's a bit niche in terms of for your listeners, isn't it? But I always say to the kids, that's only still open because of a campaign that I led in the early 2000s. Now, Lancashire County Council was going to close 36 of the care homes. They closed most of them, but kept this one particular one open. And I still take a real pride out of the fact that I, working with somebody at the County Council at the time, was able to interview residents in that care home. Now, the guy who I was working with at the County Council had assumed that the residents were going to say they were all up for moving. The couple he got me to interview hadn't actually been told whether they'd be allowed to stay together when the care home shut. Right. Well, you can imagine the front page that came from that. And obviously, but to be fair to the County Council, by the end of the following day, they'd been told they could stay together. And on the back of that was one of the care homes that was kept open. And in the grand scheme of things of life, just keeping a care home open, it's probably a bit of an odd thing to be super proud of. But I always tell the kids that story because that's what journalism can do. And it's not about saving care homes or getting changes in the law like Awab or Isha. Journalism is something really, really special that actually holds the fabric of society together, not just in kind of the civic sense, but look at the role sports journalism plays at football. Mm. And there's so many people who like to knock it for all the things that we've talked about, but I think it's really worth championing. We need to find a way to preserve and protect it because it does make a difference, and people do miss it when it's not there. But when it's not there, it's too late.
Yeah. Well, again, anyone listening to that will hear the passion come through. Thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been great to catch up after all these years. We'll probably not make it 25 years again in the future, but thanks so much for sparing the time, and it's been a real pleasure.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real-world stories from the PR frontlines.